Nicholas Ray's Rebel Without a Cause came out in America on October 27, 1955. The picture was Ray's most commercially successful oeuvre. Its success was mainly credited to the cult following of the then-late James Dean, a hero among the youth, who had been killed in a car crash less than a month prior to the film's release. However, Rebel's spectacular widescreen presentation played a distinctive role in the picture's commercial glory. Rebel Without a Cause was, to an extent, a product of Hollywood's battle against the advent of television. The spectacular widescreen format of the film was 20th Century Fox's recently invented photographic process called CinemaScope, which saw its debut 2 years prior with the biblical epic The Robe in 1953. CinemaScope used anamorphic lenses that would capture a squeezed, wide-lens image onto standard 35mm negative film, and then would be unsqueezed with the same kind of lenses popped onto the 35mm cinema projectors, making the optical illusion of a spectacular width to wow audiences during theatrical exhibition. Fox's patented process was invented to conquer television's 4:3 aspect ratio, giving audiences a reason to actually go to the cinema. However, artists like Nicholas Ray used CinemaScope beyond its wow factor, finding an artistic use in it. CinemaScope in Rebel Without a Cause is creatively used primarily to express the themes of loneliness, connection, intellectual level, and power of the film's characters, through the use of extremely wide spaces and the position of characters in them. But also, being less important for Ray, CinemaScope was used spectacularly, showing the Los Angeles skyline in an ultra-wide frame, in order to get the television-watching youth into the cinema. In order to understand the thematic purpose of Ray's use of CinemaScope, which was ordered by Warner Bros. Head, Jack Warner, after watching the black and white rushes of the picture and considering Rebel a very important film, one must first understand the main themes of Rebel Without a Cause. As Geoff Andrew puts it, Rebel is a psychological study of middle-class American youth through the characters of Jim, Judy, and Plato. In the second scene of the film, all three characters are in detention at a police station, each having rebelled against their respective families. Jim, played by James Dean, has rebelled against both his mother, who is more concerned about upholding a respectable appearance than to console him, and his father, too weak to provide Jim with the guidance he needs. Plato, played by Sal Mineo, rebels against his parents simply not being there, and Judy, played by Natalie Wood, against her father's reluctant acceptance of her maturity. Ultimately, the lack of love and understanding in each of the three characters' families leads to their respective solitude, which they are all rebelling against. The visual expression of solitude is distinctly one of the purposes of CinemaScope in the sequence of Jim exiting the planetarium and encountering Buzz's gang, which we will analyze. In this shot, the mindless crowd of teenagers has just left the frame, leaving the lecturer, Jim, and Buzz in the shot. The use of CinemaScope to include these three particular characters in its wide frame has a significant thematic meaning to the film's overall theme. The lecturer in the frame has just shown the kids that the world, which will not be missed, will soon explode into a cloud of red gas, and that man himself seems an episode of little consequence, a typical 50s zeitgeist. The space show that the class has just seen, most likely subconsciously for the mindless crowd, and definitely knowingly for Jim and Plato, reminds the kids exactly what it is they are rebelling against. As Geoff Andrew puts it, the injustice, briefness, and ultimate solitude of existence. As a result of this solitude, Buzz eyes Jim in the shot with the intention to start a knife fight in order to do something in this suburban tristesse of morose aimlessness. Thus, the particular inclusion of the lecturer with Jim and Buzz in the extra-wide CinemaScope frame clarifies the motivation for the need of a knife fight, as well as all of the succeeding actions of the troubled kids. Right after this shot, we see in the foreground the kids briskly exiting the dome of contemplation, the planetarium, while Plato stays behind, hiding in the background. The use of wide space to connect key characters in triangular groupings, as Ray calls them, is one of the main effects of CinemaScope in Rebel Without a Cause. Plato, being in the background, is small, which reflects his vulnerability to the mindless kids and to the meaningless world. In this shot, Jim, alone, in a vast widescreen space, walks to the right and the camera follows. Jim's solitude is literally shown as he is the only one in this wide frame, or vast world, highlighting the loneliness he feels from the lack of understanding from his family and colleagues, and from his struggle with maturity. However, the camera pans, revealing Plato in the shot, uniting the two victims of solitude in one wide frame. This shot reestablishes the connection between Jim and Buzz, both looking at each other again. Buzz anticipates the fight. The delinquent in the foreground blocks the exit for his victims in the background, now being Jim and Plato. Buzz being in the foreground makes him larger in relation to Jim and Plato, making him be in control of the situation. Jim decides to move towards Plato, attempting to avoid conflict. Seeing Jim leave, Plato makes a run for the exit, but is confronted by Buzz. This sequence is complemented by a reverse shot, exposing Bud in front of his gang. This shot shows how Buzz is surrounded by his mindless sheep, who fill the width of the frame, while this shot demonstrates Plato's emptiness of space, denoting his loneliness. With Plato's exit being blocked, he is ultimately forced to find refuge in the dome of contemplation, the appropriate milieu for a thinking character, like the appropriately named Plato. Here, once again, CinemaScope shows us Jim's solitude, as he is in the middle of a wide frame of space. However, his solitude is broken again, by Plato running into frame. This shot not only enhances the theme of Jim being literally locked away, alone, in the Griffith Observatory, lost in an enormous city, Los Angeles, as his skyline fills the CinemaScope shot, but also the width of the frame exploits the spectacle of the picture. Presenting the gorgeous LA skyline from the Griffith Observatory in CinemaScope is something 50s audiences could just not experience on their 4x3 televisions. Thus, the wide format attempts to also amaze and overwhelm as well. Here we see Plato's isolated mansion is not much bigger than a dot on the huge CinemaScope screen. The use of wide frame here highlights the harrowing city of angels, or the world, over the minuscule refuge that Plato offers to Jim.
Come on, let's go.
These two shots incorporate all the pieces of the narrative in its wide screen. Jim, Plato, and then the two of Buzz's gang, preparing for conflict.
There he is.
The position of Plato at the far right of the frame, being small, is not ready to deal with the conflict, whereas Jim in the foreground, being larger, is. In relation to Jim's size here, the gang in this shot is much smaller and nowhere near filling the frame. Thus, this manipulation of depth through CinemaScope hints that the gang is, in reality, much weaker than Jim. Furthering this argument, this shot witnesses Jim sitting up and getting even bigger in the frame, thus clearly much larger and stronger than the gang, being the work of a great auteur whose originality lies not in the subject matter he chooses, but in the technique he employs, in the thought he puts into his mise-en-scène. This subtle difference between these two shots reveals why Rebel is considered Ray's most psychologically revealing film. Although the gang fills the width of the frame, here, none of them receive any focus except for Judy, who is mindlessly showing off, whereas Jim dominates his own shot, not sprawled across the full width of the frame, as during the opening credits, but sitting large, almost centered, and most importantly, alone in the frame, thus getting all the audience's attention and true focus at the center, telling us that Jim, unlike the gang, is truly important. And due to being physically elevated, a sort of higher power, or God, as well, being not untrue to what some of his contemporaries and fans thought James Dean to be. Although the girls are in medium close-up in this shot, their power is not expressed as they are simply doing their makeup without any true thinking. This shot can be seen as a contradiction to this power argument. However, it is not the case. This shot may be interpreted as the gang having power due to being larger than Jim and Plato, but ultimately we only see the backs of their heads, and one is putting on makeup. But it is Jim and Plato who are in the dome of contemplation, and the distance between the two forces reflects not Jim's weakness due to size, but his intellectual difference and superiority, expressed here by the physical distance and elevation of Jim from the gang. A few shots after, Jim's size decreases from this shot due to the irritation of his tire being pierced. But he ultimately reacquires his position of superiority by convincing Buzz that violence is not the solution to solve a conflict. Jean-Luc Godard once said, "There was theater, Griffith, poetry, Murnau, painting, Rossellini, dance, Eisenstein, and music, Renoir. Henceforth there is cinema, and the cinema is Nicholas Ray." With his creative and intellectually stimulating use of CinemaScope's widescreen format, by thoughtfully placing characters in specific areas and fields of the screen in order to express the themes of loneliness, connection, intellectual level, and the power of Jim, Plato, and Buzz, as well as fitting in awe to overwhelm the television-bound audiences of the time, all in the exiting of the planetarium sequence that we just analyzed in Rebel Without a Cause, makes Nicholas Ray indeed cinema.